Hi there, welcome back to Inde-Car on the 8th of May. There are two stories in the news today which, although seemingly unrelated, I think, show exactly what the United Kingdom government is now thinking and what they expect to happen in the next couple of years. Now, the first story I think that everybody probably knows about is John Swinney's swearing in as Scotland's new First Minister. Now, the BBC, as it normally does, has misrepresented this rather spectacularly, I think, by claiming in many of the news outlets that John Swinney has been elected as the First Minister of Scotland. Now, we all know, because we live in Scotland and we watch what's going on around us and we experience this, we see it and feel it and understand it, that John Swinney wasn't elected at all to be the First Minister. He was chosen by a cabal at the top of the parliamentary SNP party. And he's been chosen to replace Humza Yousaf for a reason, and that is stability primarily. Political stability. The SNP wants to try to basically calm things down. The BBC, it was understood at the time, I think, by the SNP that the BBC was going to go on and on and on about so-called SNP divisions if Kate Forbes had actually continued to mount a challenge to John Swinney's leadership campaign, and that would have resulted in several weeks of campaigning, and the BBC would have had a fantastic opportunity to jump in there and gleefully point out the divisions, in inverted commas, inside the SNP and the broader independence campaign. But of course the SNP's coronation, if you like, of John Swinney has neatly avoided all of that and left the BBC grasping at straws. So they're now claiming that John Swinney has been elected as the First Minister of Scotland, making it sound as though there was some kind of democratic event in which the people of Scotland got to choose, which of course isn't true. John Swinney has simply been selected from two potential challengers, and Kate Forbes obviously has done a deal with John Swinney, and she is going to be given some plum job in his new administration in return for dropping out of the race. Now, the other candidate who raised his head above the parapet, man from near Loch Lomond, who briefly said that he had enough signatures for a campaign of his own to challenge John Swinney, appears also to have dropped out mysteriously at the last minute. And there is a lot of speculation about whether the SNP got at him in some way. But I think the simple fact of the matter is it was a brief attempt, I think, perhaps even a protest by this man, just to point out the fact that there hasn't been any kind of an election taking place, even within the party, let alone within the broader nation itself, about who the First Minister should actually be. And I noticed also today on the internet that one particular independence campaigner has published a copy of a letter sent by Douglas Ross to John Swinney, and far from congratulating him on being elected or chosen to be the First Minister of Scotland, made a whole series of demands and angry protestations about why he had to stop doing this, that and the next thing, otherwise, you know, it was all going to be catastrophe. And actually, Douglas Ross's letter was just a list of 3 things that he demanded John Swinney should do. First of all, abandoning all attempts at campaigning for independence, cutting ties with the Greens, and returning to policies which Douglas Ross thought were more important. Things like running the country, for example. Now, running the country is, you know, the bread and butter of everyday Scottish government business. But Ross wanted him to disengage from the independence campaign and to retask the civil service away from all kinds of preparation of papers about how great Scotland would be if it was independent, and back to the more mundane things about how it was going to manage with the massively cut funds which his own party was providing for Scotland to try to run its affairs. So I think the mood music at the moment, politically, especially in the media, about John Swinney is that there is a muted delight amongst the BBC and the unionist cabal that John Swinney has been chosen, elected, or just basically shoved in there because no one else wanted to do the job. And they have been deprived of their fun of watching a rather damaging and bruising campaign between him and Kate Forbes. But all the same, the outcome seems on balance to be largely what the United Kingdom wanted. So that is the first point I wanted to make, that John Swinney's appointment, for want of a better word, suits the narrative of the mainstream media and the United Kingdom in general. Now, the other piece of information which emerged today in the United Kingdom's Defence Journal, and it's emblazoned on its headline, incidentally, is that all warships for the United Kingdom Navy are now going to be built only in Scotland. Either on the Clyde here near where I am, at either Scotstoun or Govan, or in Rosyth, depending on the size, shape and configuration of the ships. Allied to that, the Defence Journal also goes on to specify how much money the United Kingdom is pouring in to the various companies, such as Babcock's, into apprenticeships. 500 new apprentices being hired across the board in Scotland to maintain the construction of British warships so that they can be produced at cost, on budget, and sometimes 2 or 3 of them at a time, all worthy sort of things that you would do when you want to build naval warships. But I think the hidden message in this is that the United Kingdom is putting all of its defence eggs, if you like, in terms of its naval force, in the Scottish basket. And that tells me that they are now supremely confident that Scotland is not ever going to be independent if they have anything to do with it. Otherwise, why would they invest all of their energies in manufacturing all of their naval ships only in Scottish yards? We know that submarines are routinely manufactured in the north of England, for example, and this is a bit like the BBC, one of those ways in which they claim that the United Kingdom is spreading the work around the various regions and nations of these islands. And that is, of course, part of the narrative, that we're all one big happy family and everything's wonderful. But then there was another little item that appeared in my news feeds this morning, which showed that the percentage block grant which we normally receive as our pocket money from England after they've withheld 40% of our own taxes has actually been cut in half almost. It's now down at about 4% of the national UK spend. Now, Scotland, under the Barnett formula, is entitled to approximately 8.4% of the United Kingdom's total spending in terms of what it gets in its block grant, and that's based on the number of people who live in Scotland being approximately 8.4% of the UK population. So why are we only getting 4%? Well, I think the answer to that is that it's a net loss, because in England they've chosen to cut public spending again massively, to the point where the National Health Service is almost in ruins and almost unmanageable, and other public services also being cut. But because Scotland maintains its public service spending at a certain level, the Barnett formula means that because England has cut its spending, it means that the Barnett formula 8.4% of that public spending is now 8.4% of something much less, and Scotland's spending is still at the same level it was the year before. That translates into a cut of 4%. Now, the only option for the Scottish Government would be to cut its budget, in other words, the money it spends on its public services, to the same degree as England, in order to see, if you like, roughly 8.4% of the English spend coming to Scotland. But remember, it's 8.4% of much less. So being chained to the United Kingdom indefinitely like this means that we suffer exactly the same cuts, in fact sometimes worse cuts, because we like to maintain our public services. We don't want to cut our health services, we don't want to cut our social services, we don't want to cut our other budgets which support the most vulnerable people in society. It's a difference in morals, and it's a difference, I think, in ideology here in Scotland that makes us different from the rest of the UK. So in the round today, my analysis is that the focus of the BBC, and remember today, just today itself, on their website, there are no less than 7 separate articles about John Swinney. Nothing else but John Swinney. So they obviously are really enjoying this business of John Swinney being there, and most of the coverage about John Swinney is actually quite factual and, relatively speaking, unbiased, although it will point out the obvious things like, oh, he really needs to stop all this stuff about independence and get on with the day job, but you would expect that. So there's a heavy focus from the mainstream British media on John Swinney being the man for the job, and they claim he's been elected. And then there's this business of all of the naval ships of the United Kingdom now to be built only in Scotland, nowhere else at all, and all of the money is being poured into Scotland. So this is a double-edged sort of bribe and threat. If Scotland were to leave the United Kingdom, the first thing the UK would say is, we're no longer going to build our warships in Scotland. We're going to pull all of these orders out of your yards. Well, they threatened that the last time, and that didn't happen, and it would be very unlikely that the companies which have invested billions of pounds in building warships in Scotland for the UK Navy would want to relocate elsewhere and lose all that money. Remember, these are the very same people that support the Union. So it's the same old, but the mood music at the moment is that the UK thinks the war is over and they think that Scotland has lost. And they're so confident in it that they're prepared to bribe us a little bit by saying they're going to build all their warships here, and at the same time seem to be thoroughly approving of John Swinney with, well, let's say, neutral coverage, but very heavy coverage in the BBC's website, particularly about Mr. Swinney. I remain to be convinced about what will happen with independence. At the moment, like many other commentators, I'm deeply pessimistic about Mr. Swinney's stewardship of the SNP and guiding anything towards independence. But there are interesting stirrings in the background legally about Scotland's position internationally, particularly with the United Nations, and I'll be able to tell you a bit more about the progress that's been made on that very soon. For the moment, I can tell you that progress is being made, and that there is an effort ongoing to have Scotland recognised as a country within the United Nations. It needs Scotland to be recognised by one other UN member as a state and kind of sponsored. That would lead to the United Nations making a ruling, well, through the International Court making a ruling about whether Scotland is in fact a colony or whether it is part of a voluntary union. Now, it's going to be extremely difficult for the UK to prove we're in a voluntary union, partly because what the United Kingdom told the UN that Scotland was is actually different from the reality. And it's being able to ask that question of the UN and say, look, Scotland can prove that it's being treated as a colony, despite what the United Kingdom may have told you back in 1960 about Scotland's status. And if we can get the United Nations to accept that Scotland may well be a colony or a crown dependency, then our route to independence becomes much easier, because the United Nations would then recognise our right to full self-determination as a nation. And that's why the legalities are important. But I'll have more to talk about on the progress of that legal case, which is about to be taken to the International Court of Justice and the United Nations, once I know a little bit more about it and once the legalities have been written up properly and prepared so that the case is rock solid. In the meantime, please keep the faith. Remember that despite what the BBC might be crowing about, and despite how comfortable the United Kingdom might seem in building its warships in Scotland, the fight isn't over yet. They think it's all over, but it definitely isn't. Anyway, I will see you soon. Bye for now.